wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead. She mourned for her husband. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. You may be seated.
Good evening. Glad we can be together and study again tonight. Some of you are here for the first time today, maybe for the first time ever, and I hope any time that we have guests, first of all, as members, we're alert to that. We're looking for unfamiliar faces and ready to welcome them. And I hope that if you are a guest, whether again first time or 51st, that you can say, these are friendly folks. My presence there meant something to them. We want it to mean something to you by receiving a spiritual benefit certainly as well. We are down tonight. In fact, our crowd's a little bit better than I thought it might be. So with one's going on spring break and our Oklahoma trip folks, I know they're doing great work. They had a full plate, just VBS and the benevolence and different things there helping out in Luther, Oklahoma. So we'll be getting reports back certainly afterward. And I know that it's a life-changing and faith-affirming event. I'm glad it's good for our young folks and their adult chaperones. It'll be good for the folks in Luther, Oklahoma as well. We're looking at a lesson tonight. Have your Bible open to 2 Samuel 11 about David and Bathsheba. You know that a lot of times in my PowerPoint lessons, I try to have a background or a picture that kind of goes along with the topic. Now think about that tonight. I had to be very selective. I couldn't put just anything up there to illustrate some of the events of David and Bathsheba. So I had to be discreet and would encourage you to as well if you're searching for that. But many of us know that lesson. Brother Joel, I appreciate the synopsis and that good kind of brief reminder. We'll be looking at some details and thinking about lessons we can learn from this story. Everything in the Bible's there for a purpose. There's no filler material. There are no just stories that are fluff or just in there for no good purpose. This is an ever-enduring warning, a cautionary tale, I believe, maybe to men especially, about a very dangerous thing that could happen to any of us. We're thinking about how David, who is a man after God's own heart, was a man for this story and for this brief moment in time, a man after another man's wife, in fact, Uriah. And we'll get into that and talk about how that happened and some things by way of prevention. What can David teach us about being truly after God's own heart? In 1 Samuel chapter 13, there's a reference to God wanting a king, wanting a man after his own heart. That is never said back in the Old Testament about David, and yet you come to the New Testament and you do see it there. There's a reference in Acts 13:22 about David being that way. And while David was relatively great and maybe more righteous than just about any of us could ever hope to be, the Bible at least records stories like this that show his flaws in a very public light. I'm sure as David lived beyond the effects of this story, how it filled him with shame. And had he known that not just for his generation or maybe one succeeding, but for years, in fact for millennia, this story would be recorded and told and retold. It didn't take away from the shame. It didn't make him sin every time that story's read or evaluated, certainly, but it is, maybe as he would think of it, if it would help someone else prevent that and not make the mistake that I made and not have to live with the tragic consequences, maybe it would be worth it. Not only is the life of David that we're studying, the lives of all Bible characters, just about any of them that are recorded for any length, you find some reference to a slip-up, to a sin, a transgression, sometimes multiple ones, obviously. And they're recorded to help us know that there was only one perfect person, and that perfect one was Jesus Christ. He was tempted in all points like we are, yet without sin, but everybody's going to be tempted. Only one could boast or brag that he truly had never slipped up. As 2 Samuel opens chapter 11, everything up to this point looks favorable, and David is kind of reaching a point of notoriety in a good way. He's helping Israel to be stable and solid there. But it says in verse 1, now it came to pass in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him. By the way, Joab is his army commander, army captain, if you will. David sent him and all Israel, and they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. David remained at Jerusalem. As we kind of look at the story and evaluate it and second guess the events here, as David must have countless times in his own life, he thinks about the fact, number one, that God had already, way before David ever walked the face of the earth, said back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, for example, in verse 14, about future kings, neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. David had 6 wives, some would say 7, numerous concubines, incidentally, a lot of different children by these different women. And this is said after the fact that while he's not hurting for female companionship and his bed never should have been empty, he's still looking for something outside of that. There'd be a reference, and David full well knew the commandments, including those 10, that you are not to commit adultery, and you are not to murder, and you are not to covet other people's wives. In the scope of this one story, you see David committing not just one sin, incidentally, but several, that are all kind of an outgrowth or are a snowball effect of one bad decision that he makes. As he's turning away from God's heart, not to it, not living in a way that is consistent with what he had been doing up to this point in time, 2 Samuel 11 is a turning point. And the first thing that we notice is he is where he was not supposed to be. Typically, springtime of year, people are warring. David would have been the captain. He would have been at the forefront, offering leadership, not expecting or even kind of commissioning Joab, hey, you do what I normally would do. He would be working in conjunction with David, not on this occasion, not on this spring here. Often being in a place where we're not supposed to be or where it's not customary for us finds a new breeding ground, if you will, for temptation. And notice also going where you're not supposed to go. I don't know what happened to David that night, as verse 2 records. It happened one evening when David arose from his bed, walked on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. You can speculate all you want to. It might have been insomnia. Who knows? We don't know if he was at a particularly down time or just wanted some fresh air, but he looks. A lot of people have made assumptions, I think, about Bathsheba here. I think if you watch movies, which I haven't, about this, and hear the speculations that she's a woman that is an opportunist. She knows that David, if not on that occasion, at least on others, might have a vantage point to where she is. And so, under view not of the whole city, but of his palace, he could see her, and maybe she is trying to win his attention. I'm going to assume that that's not the case. I believe that she was simply out there talking about her bath there, the bathing. It seems to be after her monthly impurity. And so she is not trying to gain an audience with David at all, but he sees her. Not wrong for him to observe her beauty. Not wrong, incidentally, for him to just gaze, but at that moment in time, he could have decided, it is time for me now to retire back to my chambers. I need to get back in bed. This can't be something that would ever work out in my favor. David had a choice to make. And you see again, seeing the progression of it and the lust, the temptation that is very quickly taking hold of David. You see in verse 3 him sending and inquiring about the woman. Doesn't even know her name at this point, does he? And someone said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? I think it interesting that there are 2 references to her regarding men in her life. Number 1, she is this man's daughter. Every woman starts out as a little girl sometime, doesn't she? That's just the way it is. And so she's a daughter, and she's also married. And Uriah is her husband now. Sure, she's very beautiful, but David, why are you asking about her? What kind of interest do you have in her? Maybe unbeknownst to the messengers, the ones who are just simply doing the king's bidding, this inquiry is strange to their ears. But when they give him the name of her, In verse 4, he sends the messengers, took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house. Again, speculate, if you will, about whether she was complicit, whether she loved the attention of the most powerful man in the land, or whether she was kind of in a position where, especially as a woman in that day and age, you didn't just tell, especially a man who is in a position of power, no. Maybe everything within her said, this is not right. I am married and presumably happy. And so King David, why are you doing this? And should you be doing this? Think of her possible shame and humiliation as she spends some time with the king and then is summarily sent back to her house there. It's not long before, in verse 5, she conceived and she went and told David and said, I am with child. At this point, the story could have taken a very drastic turn. David might have owned up to his indiscretion and had Uriah summoned to come home and explain the situation. Hey, I was out, I saw her, she's a beautiful woman, you and I both know that. I did something that I'm ashamed of, and I took her, and she's pregnant with my child. I am so sorry. I know I can't make it up to you, I can't make this right, but I want you to know, as the king, God judges me as he would anybody, and so what can we do about this? David didn't choose that route. What did David do? In verse 6, as he had Joab, his army commander, send me Uriah the Hittite, David dutifully had him received there. Joab probably unknowing about what is going on there behind the scenes. Uriah comes home, and David asks about the war and about how the fighting is going, how the people are doing. I envision David kind of, you know how people are when you're talking to them or maybe you're talking to someone else, they're not paying attention. Their mind is dreaming, and they may not even make good eye contact. And he could have told him, everybody's dead, Joab too. And David said, well, that's nice. But he's listening, but he's not really listening. Joab, as the army commander, is losing one of his best men. In fact, Uriah is going to be listed later in this book as one of the mighty men, the valiant soldiers of David. That's kind of interesting in retrospect, isn't it? David has hatched a plan here. Uriah's home. I want you, Uriah, in verse 8, to go down to your house and wash your feet. And so Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food from the king followed him. Maybe the latest Barry White CD to play, a little soft music in the background to set the tone for a nice evening for this seasoned soldier back home with his wife. Tell you what, everything you read about Uriah is said with the utmost respect. Here is a soldier that must have yearned for the day that he could come back home and be reunited with his wife that, according to his honor, says, I can't do that. Not when my captain, when Joab is there and the men, my fellow soldiers, I can't do that. Uriah resisted the order from the supreme commander because his honor was at stake. He knew that might have got him in trouble. He wasn't fearful of that. And so Uriah is spending the night outside the king's palace. Isn't that interesting in verse 9? Wouldn't go down to his own house. And they tell David about it. You know, once a path has been set, a progression of wrong, often we don't care about values. We don't care about truth getting in the way. It's one of those things we have to jettison sometime. Uriah, didn't I send you down? Didn't you understand the orders? It's almost like I'm doing you a favor. Can't you appreciate that? And why did you not go down? And Uriah gives that classic defense there in verse 11. David, the next day, gets him drunk. Surely, with his defenses down and softened by wine and its effects, surely he'll go down and be with Bathsheba. No one will be any worse for not knowing there. Didn't happen. Uriah is still under the influence, refuses, has enough judgment and discernment about him not to go down to his house. But in the morning, David turns not even to plan B. I guess it's plan C or D about this time. All right, well, how are we going to fix this? We've got a problem, a royal problem on our hands. Uriah carries back his own death sentence. Joab sinned and put Uriah in the fiercest part of the battle, the place where he's going to be the most vulnerable, and then withdraw from him. If I'm Joab, I'm thinking, what did this guy do? You had me sin and get him from the midst of the battle. He's home for a few days. Now he's back and he's to die. What in the world did Uriah do? Sure enough, it happened that way. David is yearning for news, listening maybe every moment. How's it going? And when he finally understands that according to his plan, Uriah has been killed, he allows that period of mourning that Bathsheba has for her husband, and then she comes to David's house and she becomes his wife. And that great classic estimation from God about how this whole sordid affair is working out. The thing that David did displeased the Lord. If it hadn't displeased anybody else, rest assured, God's displeasure was the most important. David couldn't make it right. There wasn't enough yes men, enough army servants or soldiers to applaud David and make him feel good about that, to make it right. The thing that David did displeased the Lord. Several things were wrong about the course that he pursued there. Some of you know about a book written by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Maybe you read it as an assignment or just because you wanted to. The Scarlet Letter. It involved this Hester Prynne, who she wasn't the only one, obviously. It takes two to be in an adulterous relationship. She becomes pregnant, has a daughter, was her name Pearl, and as a consequence, when that is discovered, she has this embroidered or emboldened letter A that she wears around in red to signify that she was an adulteress. The day and age in which maybe there was a more harsh judgment against the woman unfairly, and that's not so far removed from John chapter 8, the woman that caught in adultery brought to Jesus. That story's pretty interesting, isn't it? Today, that scarlet letter A would not stand for adultery. It might stand in the minds of a lot of people now. We're not talking about God's perspective, but admirable or awesome, agreeable, advantageous. A lot of people don't think that we even ought to speak in terms of sin or adultery or even David doing something that would be inadvisable at all. But let me tell you again, the thing that David did displeased the Lord. You come to your New Testament as well as the Old, and you see repeated references to the sin of adultery, the sin of it. Not just as we sometimes try to soften it. Oh, I made a mistake. And yes, some mistakes are not sins, but this is a sin, but it's more than just a mistake, isn't it? I need to realize that this is one of those things that can separate me from God. All sin does that, obviously. Isaiah 59, 1 and 2, my iniquities and my transgressions separate me from God. But this is one of those, the words of passages like Galatians chapter 5, the work of the flesh. I will not inherit the kingdom of heaven if I'm guilty of it. And so what David did was very tragic. I think he knew it. I think he knew it in real time. I think that any of the folks around the situation that got wind of it would have also known, David, why did you do that? Again, it's not that you're a single guy looking. You've tried all the different dating websites, and no one is compatible with you, and so your urges are out of control. This is not that at all, is it? There is no defense, no excuse for what happens here. I wonder when in time Bathsheba comes, and she's part of the royal residence there, and they notice that her belly is getting bigger by the day. She's pregnant. I wonder if someone said, isn't that kind of bittersweet that her husband Uriah didn't live long enough to see their child being born into the world, and others more astute at math get to thinking about, okay, he's been away in battle so long, and she should be at the time of birth by now, and it's much later than that, and so something's not adding up here. David didn't advertise it. To our knowledge, Bathsheba is not really prone to want to tell anything about it, but if we do the math, if we look at this story and see what it cost and what it paid, it's not a good situation. not any way you reckon it or look at the effects of it. Is it going to help in any way? Let's think about, number one, what it cost. It cost Uriah his life. It cost Uriah his life. Would you look at that verse? Would you read it again with me in 2 Samuel 11, verse 26? When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. Into chapter 12, Nathan, as he finally approaches God, he's going to say that you, if you'll go down with me to chapter 12, verse 9, why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? Nathan, what'd you say? Do evil. Nathan, I am the king. I can have you executed. I don't care. I'm telling you straight from the mouth of God. You've done evil. You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You've taken his wife to be your wife. You've killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. Nathan's divine word to him, this message from God is, it wasn't a random death at all. David, you are ultimately and directly responsible for it. You see, Nathan, a lot of time had passed, time enough for Bathsheba to go through her 9 months and have the child who was born by this time. Many speculate it's at least a year that's transpired before Nathan finally, after things have died down, finally comes to him with this message, this story, an interesting parable about a rich man and a poor man. The rich man, a lot of flocks and herds. There are baths going on all over the place in his livestock pen. This poor man has just one little ewe lamb, loves it like a family member. And the rich man has a guest, wants to provide a feast for him, meal. Doesn't want to take one of his multiple sheep and sacrifice it, goes and takes the poor man's little ewe lamb, slaughters it, uses it for a meal. What do you think about that, David? You could almost see David's face getting red. Rage building up. I can't believe that. What should be done to the man or with the man that would do such a thing? In verse 5, David in his anger gives his own sentence, doesn't he? David's anger was greatly aroused against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who's done this shall surely die. Man's worthy of the death penalty because of this brutal, ruthless, heartless act. Not only does he say that, in verse 6 he continues, he shall restore fourfold for the land because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, some of the boldest words you'll find in the Bible, you are the man. David, I'm talking to you and I'm talking about you. You are the one who's done this. And to David's credit, the only reason I can really figure that he's ever called a man after God's own heart is instead of putting a spear or a sword through Nathan on the spot, David backs up. As we talked about this morning, had the wisdom to accept the truth of what he said. The message from Nathan, God says, I've given you so many things. Have you forgotten about those? Did it mean nothing to you? Look at all. I would have given you much more had you needed it. Why did you do this? You've despised the commandment, he goes on to say. And David says something very insightful there. I've sinned, verse 13. I've sinned. David, you said something about paying fourfold. David could not imagine that that was going to come true. That child actually would die. And then other children of David, Amnon raping Tamar, and Absalom getting blood revenge for that. Finally, Absalom rebelling against the king. A later son, Adonijah, at about the time that David and Bathsheba's second son is to ascend the throne. We know him as Solomon, don't we? Jedediah. David, you're going to pay. You're going to go through hardship and heartache in your life. That is a window for us to see. A moment's pleasure never pays off like we think it will. It cost Uriah his life. It paid David with multiple deaths of his children. David's perversity caused adversity. You find that word adversity in 2 Samuel 12, verse 11. Absalom actually slept with the concubines, these wives publicly. You find that in chapter 16, verse 22, as again a penalty of his sin there. Cost David his reputation. One of the more maybe overlooked verses in this whole section is down in verse 14. However, because of this deed, you've given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. David, other people, these wicked people, heathen people, know what you've done. News is going to circulate. You can't bottle it up. And when they know what you've done, they're going to say, there's nothing to Israel's God. Jehovah's no different than us. Those kings don't act any differently than any of us do. And so they gave an occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. Listen, church, I don't want us in spiritual Israel to ever do that. I would hope, I could wish that no adultery would ever take place within God's kingdom. Friends, it does. And there are hardships, and there are times when it is known publicly that it is a black eye, not just on the person, not just on the ones immediately involved, but assumptions that fairly or unfairly are made against a larger body there. It cost greatly, didn't it? His influence led to infidelity in his sons. I know you're thinking this is a pretty negative story. It's depressing. It is. How do I avoid that? Well, we could go on talking about David. I want to bring it down to us. How do you avoid this sin, or really any sin in principle? I would put it this way: attack the root and you prevent the fruit. In Matthew 5, if you're taking notes, make sure you get this. With Matthew 5, long about verse 27 through 29, Jesus there in the Sermon on the Mount is going to say, you've heard it said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. Jesus didn't say, don't worry about that one. We're throwing that out of the New Testament. Don't worry, do what you, no, he didn't say that. I say to you, all ears peeled. What's he going to say? Whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And then that mystical kind of thing about if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Throw it away from you. Better to go into heaven without an eye than to go into hell to torment than one of your members perishing there. What did Jesus say? Early in the process, immediately cut off the lust that would lead to the physical act there. You see how David saw the woman bathing and turned this way, went back on? This story would not have taken place. History would not have been reshaped the way it was. And I know God in his mercy and grace brought out something good in spite of the bad. God always has a way of doing that. But the shame and the dishonor, the reproach that David lived with during his life, in some respects, past his life, is very clear there. Attack the root and you prevent the fruit. I know this is a story to men, about men. This is a story to women, because there are allurements, there are temptations that both genders face. And some women, maybe unlike Bathsheba, are the aggressors, the instigators, the ones that are making it easier for a man to want to transgress with her. Don't do it. There are similar problems involved regardless of whether it's male or female there. T. Pierce Brown, late gospel preacher, had some excellent ideas, advice about this thing. How do we attack the root? He said, number one, be careful that you do not have undue familiarity with those of the opposite sex. That goes without saying. Number two, anytime you make a mistake, commit a sin, do a wrong thing in any context, admit it, repent of it, stop it even before someone else finds out. David didn't do that. Sometimes, again, against our better judgment, and even as we've been as strong as we can, if I know I am wrong, I need then, before the snowball gets out of control, to stop it, do what I can to undo it, or at least to be right in the sight of God. And third and finally, so fill yourself with the love of God and the knowledge of the truth that there is no room for worldly things. Back in David's day, they didn't have an internet. They didn't have prominent pornography even on the cable channels and things like that. And with that, David still had an opportunity, because the devil's always been sneaky. He will be in our present generation. We must aggressively fight all allurements, including the one that we're talking about tonight. I want to close with this. An invitation is going to be offered. If you respond tonight, you are not admitting that you've been guilty of the sin we're talking about. Isn't it interesting how the timing affects that sometimes? If there's sin in your life, it doesn't matter what it is. If you need to make it right, don't say, well, I really need to respond. I think I'll wait till Wednesday or Sunday or some other time. This is an important time. Would you be able to say, like David truthfully could, I have sinned, I've sinned. No justification for it, no defense. No here these circumstances beyond my control that make me less than responsible for behavior. That never has worked, has it? Admit that I've sinned. In fact, Nathan told him in that same context of 2 Samuel 12, verse 13, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. How did God put away that sin? Not exactly sure. There were sacrifices David would have offered. And you read in Psalm 32 and in Psalm 51, legendarily recorded in the context of this sin, David is truly heartbroken, very remorseful for this act, couldn't undo it. But David in his mercy spared his life. God has put away your sin. Let's talk about for us, not David's, not Old Testament Jews, but Christians, how I can have that sin removed. In Acts 22, verse 16, a great response by Ananias to Saul of Tarsus is this. And now why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. That was said to a man, very staunch in his belief in God, very adamant in serving God in the religion that he knew it of Judaism, that still needed to make changes in his life. Whether it's that initial coming to Christ on his terms, being washed in his blood, Revelation 1:5, or as a child of God coming back home, desiring to walk in the light once more, 1 John chapter 1. If we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. What a great relief and release you can have tonight in taking it to God. Let his mercy and grace wash over you. Accept his love and his welcome once more. We're going to stand and sing for your encouragement if you need to respond. First kingdom of